ensayas rápido, no te sabes poner pie. Lo ensayas rápido, no te sabes poner pie.
Welcome back to Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small.
I'm Paul Ogden.
We are going to discuss our United States presidential primary system today. Paul, I think it's kind of corrupt.
Yeah, Mark, and I did not really understand your use of the term corrupt, because corrupt, when I hear that term, I think dishonesty. I don't know if there's anything dishonest about it.
When I'm talking about corrupt, I think of being made dysfunctional for reasons that have nothing to do with why the system is supposed to be there.
So you're saying the system is rigged, Mark?
Well, inherently so. First of all, there's no mention of political parties in the United States Constitution.
True.
The framers were against what they called sects.
I don't know if they were against sex or not, but I assume they was
Sects.
going on.
S-E-C-T-S.
Oh, okay. Oh, I was going to say I doubted that they were against it.
But they call them factions.
Sure.
And they were against those forming. Even as Hamilton and Madison were forming the first
factions.
Yeah,
exactly.
So,
which I think was a bit unrealistic on their part.
What, forming them or not wanting to form?
That they believe that they wouldn't form, or I mean, I guess you can say that it's maybe a bad thing. One could argue that, but to suggest maybe that they wouldn't form is unrealistic.
Eventually they did, and eventually the two parties for a while were the Federalist and the Republican, which became the Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Federalists kind of dropped out, the Whigs came into existence, the Whigs
eventually went out.
People lost their wigs. That was a joke. Then in 1860, the modern Republican Party came into prominence with the election of Abraham Lincoln, and since then we essentially have had a two-party system.
Well, we've pretty much had a two-party system from the very beginning. It's just the parties have changed. It seems like eventually it comes down to two parties.
Well, in the system, the way it's structured, it would seem you've got these checks and balances where you have to have one force against the other, and so.
Right.
And Hamilton always talked about there are always going to be those people who have and those people who have not. So
Hamilton gave the original 47% speech?
No, I think Hamilton was talking more like 4%. He wasn't too concerned about Democratic. He was not a Democrat.
No, not by any stretch. He favored lifetime appointment or lifetime election. Well, I don't know if it was an appointment or election of governors, state governors.
Well, it was kind of a quasi-election, quasi-appointment because they would have been elected by the legislative assembly of the state, and then they would have been in office for life.
So we had Ed Whitcomb was the governor in the 70s. He's still alive. He could have still been in there.
He sails around the world.
He's a fascinating guy.
Even though he was kind of boring as a governor.
He lived a very eventful life.
But be that as it may, when it comes to presidential primaries, the parties picked their candidates essentially on their own. The party bosses had a convention every year, and until the progressives came in the 1890s, early 20th century, there was really no input of the common people in the selection of a candidate for president of the United States.
Most states had conventions where you had delegates. A lot of times they were elected in the primary, but they would attend, and so you had national conventions, but you had states that had different ways of picking the delegates. And it's only fairly recent that most states have gone to a primary type system.
Well, the first presidential primary was a preference primary, and that was in 1910. That wasn't even a presidential election year. And
I was going to say that's not a presidential election year.
Yeah, and that's one of the problems that I have with our current system of presidential primaries. The presidential debates for the Republican Party, if I'm not mistaken, began in June 2011. I think,
and actually, that's surprisingly that calendar was surprisingly reduced from previous elections, where it was even stretched out even more.
it's just awful. I mean, and I think boring the American people is one of the sins of the primary system as we have right now. And maybe it's not boredom in the sense of not wanting to listen to what these people have to say, but boring in the sense of you hear this crap over and over and over. Let's listen to the stuff about issues, but we'll get into that.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about the history of the system. Then primaries came into existence in the early 20th century. They really didn't gain importance until the 1950s and 1960s. Right. Truman lost the New Hampshire primary because New Hampshire wanted to be one of the first primaries, and so he dropped out of the race. And then Adlai Stevenson ran against Eisenhower. I don't think anybody was going to beat Eisenhower. I mean,
no, Eisenhower won by one. Actually, his two elections were two of the biggest landslides.
Well, and the Democrats wanted him to be in their party.
Yes, they did. Yes.
And so both sides was kind of like trying to sign Babe Ruth as somebody's team. Then in the 1960 presidential election race, I think that there were 9 presidential primaries. John F. Kennedy entered 8 of them, something like that. He didn't enter all of them, but there were a couple of key primaries, and he had to sway people to believe that he was not going to be influenced by the Pope because he's a Roman Catholic.
Correct.
And you're a Roman Catholic.
Yes, I am.
And so you call the Pope every day when you...
I do. Every decision I make, I call the Vatican.
Yeah, do you call collect?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, you're able to do that?
No, I definitely could not do that.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just curious. So they don't have that much money. They had to pay out all those settlements.
Yeah.
Then 1968 was a really controversial year for primaries. First of all, that's the first year I really remember primaries because I was 13 years old, and the Indiana primary was here. I had a sibling who was working in the McCarthy campaign. They had a bonfire at our farm the night of the primary in 1968, and the Kennedy people were there, and the McCarthy people were there. And everybody's like, just kind of partying at the back of our farm, and then you get the news that night that Martin Luther King was shot, and there was a lot of crap going on, and in that primary, everything still was in play here. Indiana's primary, I think, was in April.
I don't know. Indiana ever had a primary in April.
Maybe it was March. It was chilly, or May. Whenever it was, we still were in play. The presidential nomination was in question.
Well, back then, though, they had fewer primaries.
Yes, but also it wasn't... Johnson had dropped out after the New Hampshire primary because McCarthy did really well. And I don't know that's why Johnson dropped out, but Johnson did. And in Indiana, Roger Brannigan, who was the governor, ran as a favorite son candidate for the Democratic Party against Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. And then, of course, Robert Kennedy was here in Indianapolis that night and announced to a crowd at 22nd and Delaware, a park down there, that Martin Luther King had been assassinated. But then the convention that year, Hubert Humphrey, the delegates were not pledged. They weren't committed to voting for certain candidates, and you had this huge block of candidates, of delegates that were free because Robert Kennedy was dead.
Right. By
the time of the Chicago National Convention.
Yeah.
You were a Republican. You probably didn't care.
I think that was the year they had the. It was, of course, in Chicago, and they had the
riots.
Riots. I was trying to think the right word. So the Democrats were rioting.
No,
okay, it wasn't the Democrats. It was the people outside protesting were rioting. So, but now the conventions are just pep rallies for the parties.
Well, that's because by the time you get to the convention, let's look at this year. The nomination was sewn up in June, May.
Right.
And a lot of the conventions hadn't even been held yet. or the primaries hadn't been held.
Most of the primaries we're near the end. We're in May, of course. There has been talk about moving Indiana up. I don't think that's going to happen. The trouble is, when a state moves its primary up, they tend to just move the presidential primary, so you end up with two primaries. So you have the presidential primary, say in March, you still have another primary in May for the rest of the candidates, because you don't want your candidates, typically, state representative candidates, county sheriff candidates running in March, getting nominated in March.
You want everything at once.
Well, you do want everything at once, and it just if you do that, then you got between March and November, and that's a very long campaign season, general election campaign season.
Yeah, and I don't think coroners should be an elected position. I'm sorry. I mean, there are positions where an individual
surveyor. There's a lot of positions
where a person doesn't really exercise discretion, and so it's not important for the person to be elected.
It's true, though, that there was a movement in our history about making more offices elected, with the idea that would be, the person, the average voter could make decisions about these people. But in reality, you go to the voting booth, people don't know who those people are.
Yeah, and they vote according to party line.
Yeah, and those are the races you look at when you look at party affiliation and the baseline on the party. You look at the county surveyor race, the county coroner race, those kind of races.
And statewide, you look at Secretary of State.
Right.
So, as it is right now, we have this whole schedule of primaries, and it starts as soon as January 3rd this year was the Iowa caucus for both parties.
Right, which is not a primary, obviously. It's a caucus.
No, but that's the first of 3 different rounds that Iowa has in their process of selecting
which
delegates.
Nobody really understands.
Outside of Iowa and maybe not even in Iowa.
I'm not even sure they understand in Iowa. But you're right, that is actually the only first step of the process.
Yeah, and by the time the primaries get here, it's pretty well decided.
Except for last time.
The last time, President Obama and then Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton.
But here's what happened on the Democratic side. Instead of doing winner take all, they were doing proportional. Obama got a lead. President Obama got a lead. He wasn't president then, obviously. Even though Hillary Clinton was winning states, she couldn't catch up because it wasn't winner take all. So she won Indiana, of course. But she really didn't get that many delegates compared to him because it's proportional here. I believe that the Republicans do a lot more winner-take-all primaries than the Democrats.
That would seem as a natural thing that they would do.
Yeah.
It's kind of a meat-eater dominant. Yes,
yeah, I'm not sure which is the better system.
Well,
I don't think any of the systems are good.
I think generally the primary system itself sucks because if you look at the element of what states go first, Iowa, New Hampshire has their primary this year. It was the next week was the New Hampshire primary. Then the week after that, or week and a half after that, was Nevada and South Carolina. Those are 4 states, and we're at the end of this segment. We'll be right back.